Welcome to my channel. Enjoy the content and please like, comment, share and subscribe for more. In the heart of one of Africa's bustling metropolitan cities stood the towering legacy of William Adewale, a man whose name alone sparked a flurry of fear, awe and respect in boardrooms across the continent. William was not just wealthy, he was powerful in the truest sense. His portfolio of companies stretched from the oil-rich regions of West Africa to the steel factories of Eastern Europe, from the technology hubs in South Africa to real estate empires in Dubai. He was the embodiment of dominance, the very definition of success, yet cloaked in an intimidating silence that preceded him like a chilling wind. His skyscraper headquarters, a gleaming monument of glass and steel, loomed over the city like a vigilant eye, always watching. Inside its walls, employees walked briskly, heads down, voices hushed, for the mere rumor of William Adewale's presence in the building was enough to freeze the air. No one dared to smile too widely, speak too freely, or make mistakes. It was said that if you were lucky enough to see him pass, your entire week would be plagued by tension. His gaze could slice through your soul. He never raised his voice, he didn't have to. The weight of his expectations crushed any semblance of disobedience. To him, laughter was noise, friendliness was weakness, and familiarity with subordinates was a dangerous path to chaos. He was a man ruled by order and perfection, a believer in absolute control, and his empire mirrored that belief. Those who worked for him described him in hushed tones as a god among men, though no one would ever dare utter such a phrase in his presence. He didn't joke. He didn't smile. He didn't tolerate what he deemed nonsense, which in his dictionary included tardiness, excuses, incompetence, and unsolicited opinions. There were no second chances. But strangely enough, he believed he was doing the right thing. He saw no flaw in his demeanor. In fact, he saw it as strength, a necessary armor in the jungle of corporate warfare. He believed that closeness to employees bred weakness, fostered familiarity, and killed respect. What he failed to see was that his fearsome wall, while keeping out insubordination, also kept out loyalty, trust, and love. And somewhere in the shadows of his empire, seeds of resentment had started to sprout, watered by his coldness and nourished by years of suppressed frustration. The very foundation of his invincible empire would soon tremble, not from external competition or economic downturn, but from within. A storm was brewing, one he never saw coming, because he had built a fortress so high that even his own blindness felt like security. Among the sea of faces in William Adewale's companies were people who had mastered the art of surviving under his rule. They worked like machines, efficient, emotionless, programmed to meet quotas and avoid errors. No one lingered in the break room. Conversations were brief, eyes constantly scanning for any sign that he might walk in. When the news that William was visiting a particular branch reached the office, the atmosphere would shift dramatically. The first employee to spot his armored black SUV turning into the lot would send out the silent signal. A discreet tap on the desk, a muttered phrase, or a ping in the group chat. Instantly, the building would fall into a cold, unnatural stillness. Smiles vanished. Chairs straightened. Every desk became a shrine of perfect order. It was almost theatrical, the way fear spread like fog before his arrival. But William saw none of this as unusual. To him it was evidence of efficiency, respect, and discipline. He believed that leaders who joked with their staff lost control. He was certain that to be feared was to be respected. He'd built his philosophy around a wall, one that kept him above the rest, untouchable, unquestionable. But within the hushed corridors and glass-walled offices, not everyone was content to simply survive. There were employees who had worked for him for years without once hearing a thank you, who endured the pressure silently, their resentment simmering like a slow-boiling kettle. Among them was a man named Chuka, smart, ambitious, but increasingly bitter. To William he was just another face. But to Chuka, William represented everything he detested about unchecked power. And one day, when another employee stumbled across the fact that William's birthday was approaching, a rare piece of personal information, the workplace buzzed with excitement. For many, it was a chance to do something different, to perhaps soften the air around the man they feared. But when Chuka heard the news, a different thought crept into his mind. A gift, he suggested. Something symbolic. Something ironic. Artificial teeth, he said with a laugh that held no humor. The others thought it was merely a joke, a quirky office prank. After all, William was known for his stern, expressionless face. Why not gift him a smile he never wore? They laughed, agreed, and pooled their money, unaware that they were about to become accomplices in something far darker than a joke. The day of William Adewale's birthday arrived like a rare eclipse, unusual, unexpected, and quietly ominous. For the first time in years, his employees were allowed into the private world behind his towering mansion gates. His estate was grand, nestled in one of the city's wealthiest enclaves, surrounded by manicured gardens, gleaming marble walls, and a fleet of black cars parked like silent sentinels. It was the kind of place people only saw in magazines or on television. The employees, dressed in their best clothes, approached with cautious smiles and rehearsed greetings. William stood at the entrance, dressed in a tailored kaftan, his face unreadable as always. He nodded stiffly as they filed in, offering polite wishes and handshakes. It was clear he was not used to such personal attention. Yet when he saw the small gift box handed to him, wrapped in gold paper tied with a deep blue ribbon, his stern expression softened ever so slightly. "From all of us," one of the employees said nervously. William opened the box and stared at the contents. A perfect set of artificial teeth, shining and white. A moment of silence followed. The employees held their breath. And then unexpectedly William let out a rare chuckle. It was short, awkward, but unmistakably real. "You all think I don't smile enough?" he asked. There was laughter, genuine this time. The mood warmed slightly. In a surprising gesture, William took the teeth and, as a sign of appreciation, slipped them into his mouth. "They're happy now." More laughter followed. The moment felt almost human. Almost. What no one realized, what even William couldn't have imagined, was that the gift he had just accepted, worn proudly in front of his staff, held something far more dangerous than a joke. The artificial teeth had been carefully treated by Chuka with a rare, slow-acting poison, one that didn't kill quickly but corrupted the body over time, subtly, cruelly. As the employees took pictures and clinked glasses of fruit punch, a seed of destruction had already been planted inside William's body. The man who had built an empire with fear had unknowingly accepted a death sentence masked as a smile. Weeks turned into months, and the mighty William Adewale began to feel different. It started with small things, unusual fatigue that no amount of rest could ease, a strange taste lingering in his mouth, and frequent headaches that pounded like war drums in his skull. At first he dismissed them. He was a man in his late 50s after all. Stress came with the territory of ruling an empire. But gradually the symptoms worsened. He began to lose weight, his once sharp eyes dulled, and a persistent nausea gnawed at his insides. Doctors came and went, offering conflicting diagnoses. Ulcers, anxiety, malaria. Yet none of the treatments worked. His body was slowly betraying him. The man who once strode through his offices like a titan now sat hunched in his leather chair, rubbing his temples and sipping warm tea with trembling hands. At board meetings he struggled to focus. In private he stared at his reflection and saw a stranger, pale, gaunt, and aging too quickly. His voice, once commanding, now carried a hoarseness that made him sound almost fragile. Word began to spread. First in whispers, then louder, bolder. "Something's wrong with Mr. Adewale. Have you seen how he looks lately?" In a place ruled by fear, uncertainty had now crept in like a shadow. Employees who once jumped at the sound of his footsteps now spoke of him with pity. The predator had become the prey, but no one knew what hunted him. Except one. Chuka watched it all with quiet satisfaction, hiding his glee behind fake concern. His plan had worked better than expected. The poison he had laced into the artificial teeth was a slow killer, designed to rot from the inside silently. William wore the teeth proudly for days after the celebration, unaware they were the source of his growing agony. Chuka took pleasure in watching the empire wobble without its iron-fisted king. He had served his revenge cold, elegant, and nearly invisible. But what he hadn't accounted for, what no poison could completely eliminate, was the unpredictable power of fate. In a world as vast and tangled as William's, secrets never stayed buried forever. It was on a rain-drenched Thursday morning that the first crack appeared in Chuka's perfect plan. The offices were unusually quiet, the weather casting a somber mood across the glass corridors and sterile cubicles. William Adewale had been absent for several days now. No meetings, no memos, no unannounced visits that froze the air. His illness was no longer a rumor but a reality. Some employees felt a strange sense of liberation. Others whispered worries about what would happen to the company if he died. But amidst this uneasy calm, a young woman named Amara sat frozen at her desk, her hands trembling as she clutched a file she was supposed to deliver. Amara was not particularly close to William, nor was she high up in the company hierarchy. She was one of the quiet ones, always arriving early, always doing her job with quiet precision. Years ago, when she had lost her father and was on the brink of dropping out of university, it was William who had offered her a scholarship through one of his foundation's anonymous programs. She had only learned much later that he was behind it. Though she feared him like everyone else, a quiet seed of gratitude had taken root in her heart. And now, as she sat at her desk, she couldn't ignore what she had heard just minutes ago. She had gone to the copy room and paused just outside the door when she heard Chuka's voice. He was speaking with another employee, his tone smug, almost mocking. "He probably has no idea it was the teeth," Chuka said. "Perfect gift, wasn't it? Slow and silent. Man like that needed to be brought down." The words hit Amara like a slap. Her heartbeat quickened and instinct told her to walk away, to pretend she hadn't heard anything. But something stronger pushed her to stay, to listen. She remained quiet, hidden, as Chuka laughed and continued his chilling brag. When the voices faded, she slipped away, her mind spinning. For hours she wrestled with what to do. Fear clawed at her. What if no one believed her? What if Chuka found out she had heard him? But by evening the fear gave way to something more powerful, a sense of justice. William Adewale may have ruled with iron, but he had also in his own way changed her life. She couldn't let him die like this, not when she knew the truth. The next morning she walked into the HR office and asked to speak to the head of security. Her voice trembled as she began, but she told them everything, every word, every detail. And with that act of courage, the walls of silence within the empire of William Adewale began to crack open. The moment Amara spoke, the machinery of justice, long dormant within the empire William Adewale had built, lurched into motion. The head of security, Mr. Alyamide, a retired military officer with a rigid sense of duty, listened to her testimony with a hard-set jaw and narrowed eyes. He asked for details, pressed her for the exact words, and once satisfied she wasn't making it up, quietly initiated a discreet internal investigation. Everything was done in silence. No memos, no alarms. Just quiet monitoring of Chuka's movements, a review of surveillance footage, and most importantly, the retrieval of the artificial teeth from William's home. When the lab results confirmed the presence of a rare, slow-acting neurotoxin embedded in the material, the truth was no longer speculation. It was fact. The decision to involve the police came swiftly. No warning. No announcement. That afternoon, as Chuka sat at his desk scrolling through emails, two plainclothes officers entered the office with firm expressions. "Chuka Odenigbo?" one asked calmly. He looked up, confused. "Yes. You're under arrest for attempted murder," the officer said, producing a warrant. Gasps echoed across the room. Chuka stood, bewildered, until the sight of his name on the document made the color drain from his face. His smirk was gone. He stammered, denying everything, trying to twist his words. But it was too late. The moment the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the office was no longer under the rule of fear. It was under the weight of truth. News of the arrest traveled like wildfire. Employees who had once gossiped in whispers now spoke openly, their fear of William eclipsed by shock at what had nearly happened. Some felt guilty for laughing at the gift. Others were shaken by how close they had come to being unwilling accomplices. But none were more affected than William himself. The news reached him while he was recovering at a private medical facility abroad. When he read the report, detailing the investigation, the arrest, and Amara's courage, he said nothing for a long time. He sat in his room, staring at the wall, a storm of emotions gathering behind his tired eyes. Betrayal, realization, regret. The very fear he had cultivated had almost cost him his life, not just because someone hated him enough to try to kill him, but because everyone else had been too afraid to see him as human. The empire he built had protected him from weakness, but it had also made him blind to danger. And now he had to face the fact that his illness wasn't a punishment from fate. It was a consequence of the world he'd created with his own hands. William Adewale returned to the city a changed man. Physically, emotionally, spiritually. The once indomitable titan now moved with measured steps, aided slightly by a polished cane. His face, once firm and unreadable, now bore the marks of pain and introspection. He no longer commanded rooms with his silence. Instead, people noticed the gravity in his gaze. The quiet weight of a man who had stared death in the eye and survived, not by his own strength, but because someone had dared to care when everyone else stayed silent. The gates of his mansion no longer felt like fortresses. They opened without the usual protocol. For the first time in years, William walked through the doors of his headquarters unannounced. No one expected him. There were no alerts, no rush to straighten ties or hush conversations. But when he entered the lobby, a hush fell, not out of fear but out of awe. He did not go straight to his office. Instead, he asked to speak with Amara. Amara stood nervously when she was called. She expected a formal thank you or maybe a curt nod of acknowledgement. But William took her hand gently and looked her in the eyes. "You saved my life," he said, voice low but steady. "And you reminded me of something I forgot a long time ago. That power is nothing without trust." She was too shocked to respond. No one had ever heard William speak with such humility. Over the next few weeks, everything began to shift. Meetings were no longer rigid displays of authority, but open conversations. The once fearful environment began to thaw. William invited feedback, asked about people's lives, remembered names. The man who once towered over his empire with icy detachment was slowly becoming a presence people could respect without trembling. He wasn't trying to win anyone's affection. He was learning to be human again. And in doing so, he began to rebuild something far greater than his company's profits. The bridge between himself and the people he once ruled from a distance. In the months that followed, William Adewale quietly reshaped his legacy. He didn't make grand speeches or launch public campaigns to clean his image. Instead, he chose smaller, quieter paths. He visited departments he had never stepped into before. He spoke with cleaners, drivers, and receptionists, the very people whose names he had never bothered to learn. He began attending company events not as a figure to be feared, but as a man among equals. Slowly, the culture he had once built on fear transformed into one built on mutual respect. There was no overnight forgiveness, no dramatic applause. But the air around him changed. People no longer fell silent when he entered a room. They greeted him with cautious warmth, unsure at first, then with growing confidence. Amara, meanwhile, remained the quiet hero in the background. She refused every promotion offered to her, choosing instead to stay where she felt she could make the most honest impact. William often watched her with something close to paternal pride, knowing she had not only saved his life, but had given him a second chance at something far more rare: redemption. The empire he had built still stood tall, but now its foundation was stronger, not because of wealth or power, but because he had finally learned the value of humility. The poison had nearly killed him, but it had also awakened him. And in the quiet moments, at dawn in his garden or walking through the company halls, William no longer felt like a king above his people. He felt like a man who had fallen, learned, and stood back up. Not feared, not worshipped, but understood. And perhaps in the end that was the richest legacy he could leave behind.